My name is Nola Charles, and this is for Physics 1. The structure of Lab 3 was split into two parts. The focus of Part 1 was to find the mass of the black hole by analyzing the orbit and the motion of the star around it. The focus of Part 2 was to model the spaceship in a figure-8 orbit around the planet and its moon. The results of this lab yielded an average black hole mass of about 9.7 times 10 to the 33 kilograms, as well as a configured orbit of a spaceship around its moon and planet as seen on the image to the right. For Part 1, the system was a star and the surrounding was a black hole. The initial conditions were as listed. For Part 2, the system was a spaceship and the surroundings are the moon and the planet. The initial conditions are also listed below. This lab demonstrates Newton's second law by displaying how trajectories of the orbit of the star in Part 1 and the moon and the spaceship in Part 2 are governed by the net forces acting on it. Newton's second law can be demonstrated by the momentum principle as shown on the top, where the net forces should always equal the change in momentum over the change in time, where P represents momentum or mass times velocity over time. This formula can be further derived into a form called the velocity update formula, which we use in our computational model to update the velocity and the positions of the trajectory, to plot and analyze the trajectory of the star in Part 1 and the trajectory of our spaceship and moon in Part 2. We use FNet parallel and FNet perpendicular components to show Part 1, and we use the force of gravity equation in Part 1 to show the final black hole mass, and then again in Part 2 when calculating the forces of the different objects had on each other. For my computational model, I edited the starting code by plugging in my email to generate the eclipse path. Next, I calculated the net force used with the calculation loop shown on the right. We broke the net force down to its components so we could visualize them in our model. Next, we calculated the mass of the black hole by rearranging the FGrav formula shown earlier to solve for the mass of the black hole, or MBH. We also used the broken down components of FNet arrows to visualize their movement through their trajectory. These are the snapshots of the different FNet components as the star makes its orbit around the black hole. The orange arrow represents FNet, the magenta arrow represents FNet parallel, and the cyan arrow represents the FNet perpendicular. This proves the accuracy in our calculation because FNet should always be parallel to the momentum, while FNet perpendicular should point inwards towards the kissing circle. The change in size of the arrows also demonstrates how the gravitational force is stronger the closer the star is to the black hole. The calculation loop would print out the mass of the black hole for each iteration, so we took the average of these to yield the final mass of 9.7 times 10 to the 33 kilograms. To make the number more digestible, if we know the mass of the Earth is 5.97 times 10 to the 24th kilograms, it would take about 1.62 billion Earths to match this mass. For Part 2, my computational model, first we calculated the positions between the systems and the surroundings by deriving the radius we needed. We then used that radius in the edited code by plugging in the gravitational force formula shown earlier and editing it depending on the relationship at hand. We did this to find FNet on the moon and FNet in the ship. Then we made everything move by applying Newton's second law through the position update formula. The main experimental part of this lab, however, came in testing different speeds of the spaceship until we got the stable orbit that didn't crash within the 700-hour testing range. We also were challenged in this step to try to find the magnitudes where the orbit would stabilize in a figure-8 pattern. I was able to get my orbit to stabilize, but the two lobes of my figure-8 were semi-overlapping, alluding to a potential source of human error. This is the visualization of the model with the stabilized figure-8 orbit. You can see how the potential of the figure-8 is there, it just semi-overlaps. The stabilizing velocity that we found was 26,000 meters per second in the x and y component. Anything higher would make the spaceship fly out of its orbit, and anything lower than this would cause it to crash. What does this mean? This means that the force of the parallel and perpendicular components are different from the rate of change of momentum. The net force itself represents the rate of change of momentum, however, its parallel component represents a change in speed. The object will speed up in the direction of motion is pointing in the same direction as FNet parallel. For FNet perpendicular, this shows us specifically the change in direction. What if? I would need to find the FNet by including the force of gravity in between each individual component. This would look like evaluating the respective distances between the black hole, star mass, and star, planets, and moon, and then plugging them into the gravitational forces formula with their corresponding masses. I think the dominating force would by far be the black hole, while it would probably be so overpowering that it would mute the effects of all the other forces. Thank you.